Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment. AHMETT. KURU Part 2 History. 6 Power. 3 Muslim empires, 15th to 17th centuries. The Ottomans experienced a decade of chaos after their defeat by Timur at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. 3 years later, Timur died, and his empire was divided amid the power struggles among his sons and grandsons. Meanwhile, the Ottomans recovered in an impressive way. In 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror, Fatih, succeeded in conquering Constantinople, in part thanks to the use of cannons, ending the millennium-old Byzantine Empire and transforming the Ottoman state into an empire. In the early 1500s, the main challenge to the Ottomans came, once again, from the east and from a nomadic force. Shah Ismail, r. 1501-24, founded a Shia state of the Safavids in Iran and eventually converted the Iranian population into Twelver Shi'ism by force. Supported by nomadic Turkmen tribespeople from Anatolia and Azerbaijan, called the Kizilbashs, Ismail had ambitions to invade Sunni Ottoman lands. Over a century after their defeat against Timur, the Ottomans won a victory against Ismail at the Battle of Calderon in 1514. Sultan Selim's, r. 1512-20, artilleries and musket-armed janissaries defeated the strong cavalry of the nomadic enemy, breaking the Ibn Khaldunian circle of nomadic conquest, urbanization, and subsequent conquest by new nomads. Although Ismail was defeated and his image of being an untouchable holy person was damaged, the state he founded survived. In fact, the Safavids gradually minimized their nomadic features by embracing slave soldiers and gunpowder as military instruments. The rivalry between the Ottomans and the Safavids continued for 2 more centuries, until the end of the Safavid dynasty. 3 years after Calderon, the Ottomans defeated the Mamluks in Egypt. The Ottomans eventually ruled all of Middle East and North Africa, except Iran and Morocco. The Mamluks had already been suffering economic collapse and social/demographic crisis. Beyond Syria and Egypt, other Arab cities were dealing with various problems at the time of the Ottoman conquest. Baghdad was still suffering the consequences of Timur's sacking. In short, it was an impoverished Arab world with fallen capitals that the Ottomans conquered between 1516, occupation of Syria, and 1574, definitive conquest of Tunisia. Demographic data support this observation. The estimated total populations of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa was only 11 million in 1500, showing a decline from 13.5 million in 1300. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman and Safavid empires were the 2 most powerful Muslim-majority states. There was an equally powerful empire in India ruled by the Muslim Mughal dynasty, which was founded by Babur, r. 1526-30, a descendant of Timur. Like the Ottoman and Safavid empires, the Mughal Empire had a Turkic dynasty, an Islamic madrasa system based on Arabic, and a heavily Persian literature. But demographically, the Mughal Empire was Hindu-majority. Other Muslim-majority countries of the 16th and 17th centuries included Morocco in North Africa and the Uzbek Khanates in Central Asia, but these were relatively smaller polities, see Map 4. This chapter primarily focuses on the Ottoman Empire for 3 reasons. First, the Ottoman Empire, 1299–1922, lasted much longer than the Safavid, 1501–1722, and Mughal, c. 1526–1707 empires, almost from the Mongols' destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate to World War I. Second, unlike the Shia Safavid Empire and the Hindu-majority Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire was more likely to represent Sunnis, who have constituted the vast majority of the Muslim population. The Ottomans ruled all 4 previous centers of the Muslim Caliphate: Medina, Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo, in addition to claiming Istanbul as the new center. Finally, the Ottomans collaborated militarily and religiously with various Muslim groups across a vast geography from Morocco to the Horn of Africa, from the Balkans to Crimea, and from India to Aceh. Neither the Safavids nor the Mughals ever held such a central position in the Muslim world. The Ulamad state alliance was effective in the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires to varying degrees and with different characteristics. The natural sciences and philosophy had some favored moments in the history of these empires, but they lacked a permanent institutional basis comparable to European universities. Trade was crucial for all 3 empires, but none accorded merchants an influential political position. In short, the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals had world-scale military powers, but their attitudes toward the intellectual and economic spheres were far from impressive. This underestimation of scholarship and commerce might have been less crippling in the long term had the Muslim empires had no competitors in those fields. Yet the reality was the opposite. Western Europe was progressing intellectually and economically, while these Muslim empires focused almost entirely on their military capabilities. Even militarily, European states became increasingly more powerful and occupied various Muslim-populated territories. The Spaniards invaded the last Muslim state, Granada, in the Iberian Peninsula in the late 15th century. The Portuguese occupied several Muslim ports across the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century, and the Russians conquered the Volga-Tatar Khanates in the mid-16th century. Neither the Safavids nor the Mughals attempted a serious response to these European challenges. The Ottoman Empire was the only Muslim power that tried to strategically address them in the 16th century. The Ottomans provided some support to Andalusian Muslims in their resistance against Spanish monarchs. Against the Portuguese, the Ottoman navy organized expeditions in the Indian Ocean with ships built in the Red Sea using wood brought from Anatolia. In order to give their main fleet access to the Indian Ocean, the Ottomans planned to dig a canal in Suez. Similarly, against the Russians, the Ottomans started to dig a canal between the Don and Volga rivers in order to use their fleet to save the Volga Tatars, while also descending on the Caspian Sea to contain Iran from the north. Nonetheless, due to various reasons, including technological difficulties as well as exhausting wars with the Habsburgs and the Safavids, these two canal projects never materialized. Meanwhile, the Ottomans faced European challenges even in the Mediterranean Sea. In 1538, the Ottoman fleet won a victory against a European armada assembled by the Pope in Preveza. However, in 1571, another united European armada defeated the Ottomans in Lepanto. The Ottoman army was by and large superior to any single European army until the early 17th century. At the end of the century, the failure of its second siege of Vienna, 1683, halted Ottoman expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. The major failure of the Ottomans, however, was not their geopolitical strategies. Instead, it was their inability to catch up with Western Europeans' progress in the intellectual and socio-economic realms. The Ulama-State alliance was primarily responsible for this failure. The Ulama-State alliance. According to Halil Nalsik, there were two main classes in Ottoman society. The first one, called askari, literally the military, included those to whom the Sultan had delegated religious or executive power. This class included the ulama, the army, and officers of the court. All other segments of Ottoman society, regardless of their religious identities, constituted the second class, the raya, subjects. In contrast to the ruling elite, the subjects worked for production, paid taxes, and did not participate in government. On the one hand, the ulama had a pivotal position in the Ottoman state. They monopolized the interpretation of Islam, which was the basis of the legal system and public discourse. The Ottoman ulama made laws, as jurists, ruled the courts, as judges, and ran the main educational institutions, the madrasas, as professors. The ulama exercised power from the imperial council down to the smallest unit of government. In the former, the leading ulama, the Sheikh al-Islam, Sahih Islam, and chief judges worked with the viziers. In the latter, the ulama acted as local judges, who gave order to subasis, the local chiefs of police. On the other hand, their bureaucratic status made the ulama state servants who were dependent on public salaries and government appointments. Given the significant governmental roles of the Ottoman ulama, one might misconstrue the Ottoman Empire as an exclusionary Islamic theocracy. This characterization would be inaccurate for two main reasons. First, the legislative authority of the Ottoman jurists was shared by the sultans, who issued non-religious laws, canons. Because of his extensive legislation, Suleiman the Magnificent, r. 1520-66, was called the lawgiver Kanuni. Second, the Ottoman Empire accommodated a certain level of religious diversity and was at least more tolerant of diversity than its Western European counterparts. The Ottoman Sultan recognized and superseded the religious authorities of his subjects, including the Sheikh al-Islam and the Greek Orthodox Patriarch. In a nutshell, the Ottomans ruled a diverse empire, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews worshipped and studied side by side.
The Ottoman ulama-state alliance entailed a reciprocal relationship. The ulama had certain religious, legislative, judicial, and educational prerogatives.
In some cases, the ulama also cooperated with the janissaries in deposing certain sultans.
Nonetheless, the sultans used executive powers, including coercion and finance, to dominate the ulama.
Sultanic power could pressure the ulama to legitimize such problematic deeds as the killing of several male dynasty members and top bureaucrats, as well as the confiscation of private properties of various individuals. In sum, the relationship between the Ottoman ulama and the sultan meant a mutual alliance, rather than one-way royal dominance over the clergy, or vice versa. The Ottoman ulama-state alliance followed earlier Sunni models explored in previous chapters. The Safavids, however, were innovative in establishing a Shia ulama-state alliance, although their system could also be seen as an adaptation of Sunni models. Appointed by the Shahs to judgeships as well as consultative and teaching positions, the Shia ulama became a major component of the Safavid state structure. The Safavid Shahs had two main motives for importing 12 Shia ulama from various parts of the Middle East and establishing a strong alliance with them. The first one was the Shah's policy of forcing the majority of the Iranian population to convert to Shia Islam. The ulama helped the Shahs implement this policy and eliminate Sunnis and various Sufi groups.
The second motive was to undermine the Qizilbashs, red-headed ones. The Qizilbashs were religious zealots who believed in Shah Ismail's messianic claims and regarded him as a divine figure. In contrast, the Ottoman sultans never made messianic claims.
Even in the Safavid case, the Qizilbash messianism clashed with the state-building efforts.
In order to subdue the Qizilbashs, the Shahs used 12 Shia ulama as allies.
This suppression of messianism did not mean the total abolishment of Shah's holy status. The Safavid Shahs continued to enjoy religious legitimacy as the descendant of the holy imams. The Safavid Shahs succeeded in converting the population but generally failed to subdue the Qizilbashs. In order to balance Qizilbash military power and centralized state authority, Shah Abbas, r. 1588 to 1629, recruited slave soldiers, particularly Georgian converts. Abbas's policies did not work effectively, because the Safavid Empire had a large tribal nomadic population, in contrast to the Ottoman and the Mughal empires, the great majority of whose subjects were sedentary cultivators.
The ulama-state relationship and the Mughal Empire were much more complex. The Mughal dynasty was Sunni but did not follow a sectarian policy.
Furthermore, the majority of the Mughal Empire's population was Hindu. Unlike the Ottoman policy, the Mughals recruited non-Muslims, that is, Hindus, to the military without requiring conversion to Islam. Like the Ottoman rulers, the Mughal rulers produced a set of laws, zawabit, independent of and coexistent with Sharia. Akbar, r. 1556 to 1605, the least religiously conservative Mughal ruler, abolished the poll tax imposed on non-Muslims in the two other Muslim empires, as a significant example of zawabit.
Akbar also appointed numerous Hindu officials and had a wife following Hindu rituals in the royal palace. During the rule of Aurangzeb, the most religiously conservative Mughal ruler, the public influence of the ulama became more salient. Aurangzeb tried to implement aspects of Islamic law, some of which discriminated against Hindus. In various periods of Mughal history, there were always conservative ulama who insisted on the emperor's duty to convert the Hindu infidels to Islam, but the rulers, including even Aurangzeb, did not pursue such a policy. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal ulama had many similarities in terms of the curricula they followed in madrasas. Moreover, the ulama in these three empires shared a generally negative attitude, or at least indifference, toward the natural sciences and philosophy. The next section examines some exceptional Muslim scholars' scientific and philosophical works. It also analyzes the roles of the ulama and rulers in the ultimate waning of the natural sciences and philosophy in these empires. The natural sciences and philosophy. A major Muslim center of sciences in the first half of the 15th century was the observatory of Ulugh in Samarkand. Ulugh was not only an eminent astronomer, but also a Timurid ruler.
Ulugh Observatory followed major observatories Muslims built and or ran, including the Abbasid Caliph Mamun's Observatory in Baghdad, 9th century, the Bayat Sharaf al-Dawlah's Observatory in Baghdad, 10th century, the Seljuk Malik Shah's Observatory in Isfahan, 11th century, the observatory patronized by the Mongol Hulagu and run by Tusi in Moraga, 13th century, and the Ilkhanid Ghazan Khan's Observatory in Tabriz, 14th century.
Ulugh and the Ottomans were connected through certain scientists.
Qadazad al-Rumi, 1364–1436, was an eminent astronomer who was born and raised in Bursa, then the Ottoman capital. He later moved to Samarkand and joined Ulugh team of scholars, who produced the most accurate star catalogue of the time. Ali Kushji, 1403–74, a student and co-worker of Qadazad and Ulugh, followed the opposite geographical trajectory. After the death of Ulugh, the observatory was destroyed and Kushji left Samarkand and ended up in Istanbul, the new Ottoman capital, where he accepted Sultan Fatih's offer to continue his teaching and research career. In addition to patronizing scientists, Fatih, r. 1451–81, was also interested in European arts. He invited the Italian Renaissance painter Bellini to paint his portrait. This was an exceptional attitude given that the Sunni ulama forbade the depiction of human beings and animals on religious grounds. Hence, Islamic arts were mostly aniconic and focused on calligraphy and geometric and vegetable patterns. Fatih took some steps forward in encouraging philosophy too. He commissioned two ulama of the time to write separate books that would rethink Ghazali's incoherence and his arguments on philosophy and Islam. Haqazad's book appeared to be the more acclaimed than the contender. Muhammad Turker revealed that various scholars had misrepresented Haqazad's book as a comparison of Ghazali's incoherence and Ibn Rushd's incoherence of the incoherence. In reality, Haqazad did not even refer to Ibn Rushd or his book. Later sultans did not match Fatih's positive attitude toward the arts, the natural sciences, and philosophy. The last noteworthy semi-philosophical Ottoman book was written in the mid-16th century. Khainalazade, who wrote High Ethics, Alakai Alai, in 1565, was a judge in Damascus. He was later appointed as the chief judge of Anatolia, and his book became the most influential book on ethics ever written in Ottoman Turkish. In terms of the structure, Khainalazade followed Tusi's and Diwani's ethics books. In terms of the contents, Khainalazade's main sources also included Ghazali's work, particularly the Revival, and several poets, especially Hafiz and Sadi. One influential concept Khainalazade popularized among the Ottoman elite was the circle of justice. Justice is the cause of the well-being of the world. The world is a garden whose wall is the state. The state is based on Islamic law. Islamic law cannot stand without royal authority. Royal authority relies on the army. The army cannot be maintained without money. Money is provided by the subjects. The subjects obey the Sultan because of justice. Khainalazade quoted the circle of justice from Diwani with some modifications. Previously, Ibn Khaldun had already quoted three versions of this circle, from a Sasanian priest, a Sasanian ruler, and the Secrets of Secrets. As presented by Khainalazade, the circle of justice suited the Ottoman Ulamad-state alliance with its emphasis on the interdependence of Islamic law, the state, the army, and royal authority. The transformation of Muslim ethics books from Tusi to Diwani and Khainalazade shows the declining role of philosophy and increasing status of religious preaching in Muslim intellectual life. As mentioned in Chapter 5, Tusi's Nazirian ethics was a deep philosophical work with universal questions. Diwani largely paraphrased Tusi's book in his Jalalian ethics and added more Islamic tone. Khainalazade's High Ethics was much less philosophical and more focused on Islamic preaching than even Diwani's book. The Ottoman disinterest in non-religious sciences was not confined to philosophy but extended to such newly advancing fields as cartography and navigation. An exceptional figure was Piri Reis, an admiral, geographer, and cartographer. Piri Reis drew his, now famous, world map in 1513 and submitted it to Sultan Selim. Today only one part of the map is extant, that on the Atlantic, showing coasts of Western Europe, Africa, and the Americas, as known at the time. Piri Reis acknowledged that he used many sources, including a map of Columbus, which did not survive. Later, Piri Reis wrote his Book of Navigation, a detailed book in Ottoman Turkish on sailing along coasts of the Mediterranean Sea that also reported the Iberian explorations in the New World and the Indian Ocean. He presented this book to Suleiman the Magnificent. In 1554, in his late 80s, Piri Reis was executed due to some political intrigues related to his job as an admiral. Piri Reis's execution was a tragic end to a productive life, but it was also tragic that his work did not earn him an intellectual legacy. As Stephen Sousek notes, the Ottoman ruling elite failed to use Piri Reis in the fields where he excelled, cartography and navigation, at a time when cartographers and navigators of his stature were the pampered consultants of Europe's monarchs. After Piri Reis, there is no evidence of any attempt, on the part of the Ottoman government or anyone else, to establish a school of navigation and cartography, or an office of overseas exploration and trade, features so characteristic of southern and western Europe. After Piri Reis, two Ottoman authors briefly mentioned the New World in their writings. Finally, in around 1580, a major work on the subject was written. An anonymous author compiled the history of West Indies, Terrii Hindi Garbi. Based on Italian translations of Spanish sources, the book presented Spanish explorations and conquests in the New World to Ottoman Turkish readers. It included world maps and various illustrations on American zoology and botany. This book was so important for the Ottoman elite that Ibrahim Mutafarrika included it in 1730 in the select group of books he printed in the First Ottoman Press. Although Mutafarrika updated the maps in the book, he printed the text in its original form. Its modern translator into English, Thomas Goodrich, reacted to this choice. How unusual to print a book in 1730 already a century and a half old. Even more extraordinary that it was reprinted in 1875. The uniqueness of the book was not about its quality, but the fact that there was no other major book written by an Ottoman on the New World until that time. Goodrich speculates on the possibility that the author of the History of West Indies concealed his name because of his association with the destroyed observatory in Istanbul. Why would anyone associated with the observatory be so scared around 1580? To answer this question, we should examine the observatory. A century after the reign of Sultan Fatih, Sokolo Mehmed Pasha appeared as a powerful Ottoman official who supported the arts and natural sciences. Born to a Balkan Christian family and then converted to Islam and educated by the state, Sokolo served in various top bureaucratic positions, finally as the Grand Vizier, 1565–79. He patronized an important astronomer, Taqiyuddin, in founding an observatory in Istanbul in 1577. Taqiyuddin was also a prominent scholar of mathematics and clocks. Sultan Murad III permitted him to establish the observatory with astrological expectations. In the following years, however, conditions worsened for the observatory. Sokolo died. Murad was disappointed because the observatory did not satisfy his astrological expectations, and Sheikh al-Islam Ahmed Semseddin demanded the destruction of the observatory, arguing that it brought misfortune. The observatory was destroyed by Ottoman Navy artillery in 1580. The Istanbul Observatory was the last chance for re-energizing scientific research in the Ottoman Empire. Its destruction by the Navy following the Sheikh al-Islam's opposition symbolized the decline of the natural sciences under the domination of the Ulamad State Alliance. Meanwhile, Western Europeans were surpassing Muslims in terms of astronomical knowledge. At around 1580, when Taqiyuddin's observatory was destroyed, Tycho Brahe established the first observatory in Western Europe with the patronage of the King of Denmark. By 1543, Copernicus had already published his heliocentric model, which placed the Sun at the center of the universe, contra the dominant Ptolemaic geocentric model. Brahe's observations provided necessary data to his assistant, Kepler. Inspired by Copernicus's ideas, Kepler, 1571–1630, explained the laws of planetary motion. Galileo, 1564–1642, was another European scientist who played a leading role in the development of laws of motion and recognition of Copernicus's heliocentric model. His experiments were significant for the development of modern scientific methods. At that time, the intellectual apathy among Muslims was so pervasive that they remained indifferent to these scientific developments. The telescope was invented in the Netherlands in 1608, Galileo improved it in the following year and so did Kepler 2 years later. Within few decades, several telescopes were brought to the Ottoman and Safavid empires. Yet Muslims in these places did not use this innovation to advance astronomical knowledge. If Muslims had had access to telescopes in previous centuries, when they had prominent astronomers and observatories, their response would have been sharply different.
Western Europe also achieved major progress in medical science in the 16th and 17th centuries.
In 1543, Vesalius published his collection on human anatomy, refuting many of Galen's inaccurate anatomical views, which had influenced physicians over a millennium. Vesalius and some other European physicians dissected human cadavers in conducting their research. The Catholic Church tried to limit human dissection but was unsuccessful due to political decentralization and the existence of universities in Western Europe. In the Muslim world, however, the ulama were relatively more successful in discouraging human dissection thanks to their support from the centralized state authorities and complete control over the madrasas.
A complementary factor was the ulama's prohibition of painting or sculpting the human body. In Western Europe, by contrast, dissection and anatomic depictions followed the rising artistic interest in understanding and portraying the human body. As Said Hossein Nasr stresses, during centuries without dissection, Muslims relied heavily upon Galenic anatomy and physiology. The prohibition of and disinterest in dissection in Muslim countries largely continued until the westernizing reforms of the mid-19th century.
Instead of paying attention to scientific developments in Western Europe, the Ottoman ulama focused more on religious studies in madrasas, further marginalizing the natural sciences and philosophy in curricula in the late 16th century and afterward. Even this level of conservatism was not sufficient for the Kadazadeli movement, which became influential in 17th century Istanbul. This movement was critical of the mainstream ulama, although it also included some members of the ulama, particularly certain preachers. The Kadazadelis resembled modern Salafis in promoting a literalist and puritanical understanding of Islam and condemning particular rituals and notions of Sufis. The most prolific Ottoman scholar of the time, Katip Shalebi, Haji Khalifa, 1609–57, engaged in the debate between the Kadazadelis and the Sufis. In The Balance of Truth, he searched for a middle way between these two groups by treating their arguments as two opposite extremes. Katip Shalebi wrote on various topics, including the history of Ottoman naval wars and the problems of the Ottoman state structure. His most comprehensive book was The Removal of Doubt from the Names of Books and the Sciences, a multi-volume annotated bibliography, which included about 9,000 authors and 15,000 books in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. This work included the earliest known explicit Ottoman references to Ibn Rushd's Incoherence of the Incoherence and Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. In his geographical writings, Katip Shalebi used Latin sources. He also played a leading role in translation. With the help of an associate, he translated a history book and a geography book from Latin into Ottoman Turkish. Katip Shalebi was the exception that proved the rule in the 17th century Ottoman intellectual life. Thanks to the family fortune he inherited, he was able to spend time studying broad range of issues, including Islamic studies. Like Piri Reis, Katip Shalebi was originally a bureaucrat, rather than a member of the ulama. His lack of a formal madrasa education helped make him the creative and prolific scholar he was. The conservative nature of madrasas was not confined to the Ottoman Empire. Madrasas in the Sunni, Mughal and Shia, Safavid empires were also conservative and taught similar curricula, notwithstanding their sectarian differences. Despite these handicaps, the Safavid Empire produced eminent philosophers. Mir Damad, 1543–1631, emerged as a leading philosopher and Shia theologian. His work was the impetus for the revival of philosophy known as the School of Isfahan. The most prominent student of Mir Damad was Mullah Sadra, 1572–1640, who became even more famous than his tutor. The existence of such eminent philosophers, however, did not negate the restrictions the established ulama put on philosophy. According to Hamid Dabashi, the Safavid madrasa system and its total reliance on religious endowments prohibited any financial support for students who were attracted primarily to philosophy. He explains that the works of Mir Damad and Mullah Sadra were exceptions. Having a wealthy and influential father, as in the case of Mir Damad and his student Mullah Sadra, was a crucial factor in facilitating a philosophical career. But even these two independently wealthy Shia philosophers were not totally immune to financial difficulties. In one of his extant letters to Mir Damad, Mullah Sadra complains in almost the same breath of his financial burdens in supporting his family and of harassments to which he has been systematically subjected. In short, in the Safavid Empire, the practice of philosophy was a precarious act that Persian philosophers pursued at their own peril. There was not the slightest recognition of the legitimacy of the philosophical discourse on the part of Shia legal orthodoxy. Therefore, Dabashi continues, philosophers in or out of the school of Isfahan remained the constant targets of suspicion. Mir Damud sought refuge from anti-philosophical doctors of law in his convoluted discourse, whereas Mullah Sadra practically fled persecution and lived a life of exile for some years in a small village. Some other philosophers sought a poetic or satirical discourse as haven. Dabashi's depiction of unfavorable conditions is supported by the fact that Iran did not produce a philosopher of the same caliber after Mullah Sadra. The public functions of the ulama and the problems caused by conservatism were more complex in the Hindu-majority Mughal Empire. Moreover, Mughal state policies toward these issues varied widely under different rulers. Aurangzeb, r. 1658–1707, has been regarded as not only the last great Mughal emperor, but also the most religiously conservative one. Under his authority, the Fatwa al-Hindiyya, the famous compendium of Islamic law, was written. Even this conservative emperor was unhappy with the madrasa-style classical education he received, as seen in his reported statement to his quondam teacher. But what was the knowledge I derived under your tuition? You taught me that the whole of Frangistan, Western Europe, was no more than some inconsiderable island, of which the most powerful monarch was formerly the King of Portugal, then he of Holland, and afterward the King of England. In regard to the other sovereigns of Frangistan, such as the King of France and him of Andalusia, you told me they resembled our petty rajas, and that the potentates of Hindustan, India, eclipsed the glory of all other kings. A familiarity with the languages of surrounding nations may be indispensable in a king, but you would teach me to read and write Arabic, doubtless conceiving that you placed me under an everlasting obligation for sacrificing so large a portion of time to the study of a language wherein no one can hope to become proficient without 10 or 12 years of close application. Forgetting how many important subjects ought to be embraced in the education of a prince, you acted as if it were chiefly necessary that he should possess great skill in grammar, and such knowledge as belongs to a doctor of law, and thus did you waste the precious hours of my youth in the dry, and profitable, and never-ending task of learning words. According to Fazlur Rahman, Aurangzeb's statement was exemplary. There is hardly a more eloquent and pungent criticism of the narrowness of the curriculum of madrasa-style Islamic teaching. In fact, unimaginativeness was visible even in famous advice reports submitted to Ottoman sultans in the 17th century. Kochi Bey, a high-level state servant, submitted 2 treatises to 2 subsequent sultans, in 1631 and 1640. For him, the Ottoman system was deteriorating, and the main problem was corruption, specifically favoritism and bribery in judicial and governmental appointments, and the dwindling Timar, military land tenure and tax farming, system. Kochi Bey recommended that the sultans use their central authority to re-establish a fair system of appointments and fix the Timar system. A decade later, Khatib Shalebi submitted a treatise to a third sultan. Inspired by Ibn Khaldun's idea of cyclical history, Khatib Shalebi regarded the Ottoman problems as natural consequences of the empire's aging. He also stressed corruption, particularly the fact that offices were sold to unqualified individuals who then overtaxed the people to compensate for the losses they had incurred to bribe officials. Additionally, Khatib Shalebi pointed to the increasing imbalances in government's revenues and military expenses. He recommended re-establishing a just rule and balancing the government budget. Like Kochi Bey, Khatib Shalebi emphasized the need for a decisive sultan as the ultimate solution. Kochi Bey's and Khatib Shalebi's reports were pragmatic and based on observations and financial data. They were realistic enough to acknowledge that the Ottoman system was in a worse condition compared with earlier periods. But they focused exclusively on the Ottoman state structure, while ignoring broader educational and economic problems, for example, deteriorating conditions of scholars and merchants. They also lacked insights about developments in Europe. Modern scholars who have written on Muslim political thought in the 17th century generally referred to Kochi Bey and Khatib Shalebi as 2 of the most prominent thinkers of the time. In terms of political thought, however, these 2 scholars did not have the depth of Tusi and Ibn Khaldun, or Machiavelli and Hobbes. The decline thesis, again. Some prominent scholars have presented the Ottoman case as evidence against the idea of Muslim intellectual decline. As mentioned in the earlier analysis of the decline thesis, in Chapter 4, such a revisionist history may provoke interesting questions, contribute to the expansion of knowledge via alternative arguments, and question the superiority of the West.
However, these positive aspects notwithstanding, revisionist readings of the Ottoman history as a period of intellectual dynamism are still inaccurate.
I will examine two leading examples of these revisionist scholars.
One of them is Dimitri Gutas.
He criticizes those who argue that a philosophical and scientific decline took place in Muslim lands because of the orthodox Sunni ulama. He refers to the Moraga Observatory, run by Tusi, to prove his point. During the high time of the period when Muslim orthodoxy was supposed to be at its most inimical to the ancient sciences, a very significant ancient science was not only cultivated in Islam but also institutionalized through the foundation of an observatory.
This is an erroneous example. As Gutas acknowledges, the Moraga Observatory was built by the Mongols a year after Hulagu's invasion of Baghdad and destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate.
It was not a high time of Muslim orthodoxy, it was one of its lowest times. Even before the Mongol invasion, Tusi had spent about 20 years in the AHMETT castle under the patronage of the Ismailis, who had been defined as apostates by Ghazali. Tusi was a Shia theologian, and the observatory he directed, regardless of whether some Sunnis also worked there, cannot be presented as an example of the compatibility between the Sunni orthodoxy and scientific development.
Gutas extends his claim to as recent as the 18th century. Avicennan philosophy and its subsequent development found eager cultivators among Ottoman scholars of the 16th through the 18th centuries. I have three main reservations regarding this claim. First, instead of giving them credit for commenting on Ibn Sina's centuries after him, one can criticize Ottoman scholars for not producing their own original works. Second, Gutas does not explain who these eager cultivators were. He merely quotes Khatib Shalebi referring to the names of some early Ottoman scholars, including Hakazaid. Elsewhere, Gutas defines Hakazaid's above-mentioned book on philosophy and Islam as a refutation of Averroes.
Yet Turker and subsequent experts on this subject have emphasized that Hakazaid did not even cite Averroes, Ibn Rushd. Finally, Gutas quotes only the initial part of Khatib Shalebi's passage, where the latter mentions Hakazaid, Qatazad al-Rumi, Ali Kushji, and Kaimalazade as exemplary scholars of both philosophy and Islamic studies in the early and middle periods of the Ottoman history. In the following part, however, Khatib Shalebi also stresses that, after Kaimalazade died in 1572, a period of decline began in Ottoman intellectual life. He blames certain Islamic jurists for prohibiting philosophy. Consequently, Khatib Shalebi adds, philosophy and the natural sciences waned with a few exceptions, indicating the Ottoman state's general decline. The second scholar who provides examples from Ottoman history to reject the thesis of Muslim intellectual decline is Khalid al-Ruwayhib. In Islamic intellectual history in the 17th century, al-Ruwayhib primarily focuses on the Ottoman case to show the continuing vibrancy of Muslim scholarship. For him, Diwani, 1426–1502, was a prominent Muslim philosopher who had a long-term impact on Ottoman scholars. In the words of al-Ruwayhib, Diwani, active in western Iran, especially in Shiraz and Tabriz, is arguably the most significant Islamic philosopher active after the 13th century and before the 17th century. Indeed, Diwani's Jalalian Ethics, which was written in Persian for Aquian Sultanus and Hassan, did influence Ottoman scholars, as previously seen in the case of Kaimalazade. Nonetheless, it would be an exaggeration to define this influence as a continuation of philosophical creativity and productivity. Many other scholars have questioned the originality and philosophical depth of Diwani's works, particularly given that his well-known Jalalian Ethics was an adaptation of Tusi's Nazirian Ethics with a more religious tone. For Erwin Rosenthal, Diwani was not a philosopher like the Falasifa from Kindi to Ibn Rushd, nor even like his source and model Tusi. We no longer sense in his pages their passionate zeal for truth, their inquiring mind, or their intellectual curiosity and striving. Even if we accept Diwani as a first-rate philosopher, his case cannot refute the decline thesis. Of course, there were some philosophical and scientific advances during the 6-century-long history of the Ottoman Empire. But when these works are contrasted with those in Western Europe during the same period or even those in Muslim lands in the previous 6th, 8th to 13th centuries, the Ottoman period appears to be one of intellectual stagnation. This stagnation was associated with the marginalization of merchants, as explored in the next section. Trivialization of merchants.
All three Muslim empires of the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mogul were military states in which the bureaucracy and land revenue system were designed with military focus. Trade was an important source of revenue, but merchants were not an influential class. While explaining the military nature of these three states, Hussain pointed to both their new weaponry by calling them gunpowder empires, and the influence of the Mongol administrative model, in which the whole state apparatus was organized as a single massive army. Under the Ottomans, the Timur system, which was a continuation of old Iqta system in previous Muslim dynasties, became an important institution of land regime. Through the Timur, the Ottoman state authorized military personnel, particularly the Sipahis, free Turkish cavalrymen, to manage lands and to collect agricultural taxes/revenues. Like earlier Muslim Iqta systems and unlike European feudalism, in the Ottoman Timur regime, land revenue assignments were not hereditary, and peasants were free to organize their activities. A Timur holder could not impose forced labor or arbitrary taxes on the peasants under him. According to Sevkat Pamuk, state ownership of land and restrictions on private capital were main characteristics of the Ottoman economic system until the 19th century reforms. Murat Sazaka describes the general Ottoman economic system as extremely state-centric, in which the state firmly controlled all the basic factors of production and physical capital, possessed nearly all mines and metallurgical establishments, and exerted a firm control over factor prices and mercantile profits. In short, it effectively controlled and dominated the economy. For Sazaka, this economically inefficient Ottoman system was a major divergence from the capitalist-friendly economic model of early Islamic history. In this context, the Ottoman military elite received either salaries, for janissaries and the Sultan's other soldiers, or land revenue assignments, for Sipahis. Similarly, certain ulama received salaries, while madrasas depended on waqf revenues. The bureaucrats were another group that received salaries from the state. As noted above, the military elite, ulama, and bureaucrats constituted the politically dominant class, called askari of the military. Certain military titles given to high-ranking ulama and bureaucrats indicated the military character of the Ottoman state structure. The chief judge of Anatolia, as well as that of the Balkans, was called Kadiaskar, military Qadi, though he was a civilian and a member of the ulama. Similarly, governors and some other top bureaucrats could receive the title Pasha, general, even if they were actually civilians. The other, and lower, social class comprised all subjects. Peasants, artisans and craftsmen, and merchants were all in this category. They were producers and taxpayers, but they could not participate in government or carry weapons. In Ibn Khaldun's terminology, they were supposed to lose asabiyya. The military class monopolized both the use of force and lawmaking, two components of politics. Thus, the subjects were pacified, unless they revolted. Unlike various Western European countries with city councils and parliaments, the Ottoman Empire, until the late 19th century, had no institutions in which merchants could participate in law and policymaking, including the setting of tax rates. The primacy of military concerns in the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires was reflected in their selective adoption of Western European technologies. Among the three technologies Western Europeans used very effectively: gunpowder, printing, and the nautical compass. These Muslim empires effectively adopted only gunpowder, which suited the interests of their influential military elites. These empires did not establish printing presses until the Ottoman press in 1727, in part because they lacked influential merchant classes who would support this technology for their commercial interests. Instead, these empires had influential ulama who regarded printing technology as unnecessary, if not dangerous. The story of these Muslim empires' disinterest in the nautical compass and long-distance maritime trade was similar. The Safavids and Mughals had influential military elites who focused on maintaining and improving their armies. Neither of them had a first-rate navy or merchant fleet. Only the Ottomans had an effective navy. It fought against the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean by using its ports in the Red Sea and the Basra, Persian, Gulf. Yet even the Ottoman expeditions, which included such distant places as Mombasa, East Africa, Dio, India, and Aceh, the Indonesian archipelago, were mostly limited to military purposes and took place only between the 1530s and the 1580s. Even in the Mediterranean, Ottoman sailing was primarily military. Some scholars have explained the Ottomans' indifference toward long-distance maritime trade with reference to cultural factors and ideas. Sabri Ulgener argued that, beginning in the 13th century, the Sufi actors and ideas promoted asceticism at the expense of economic competition in Anatolia. One could support this argument with some passages from Ghazali's Revival, which was a very influential Sufi-based text in Anatolia. It was translated into Turkish as early as the 14th century in an Anatolian principality. In the mid-16th century Ottoman Empire, it was, partially, translated again into Turkish.
A century later, Khatib Shalebi recorded a common saying, "If all other Islamic books disappeared, the revival would be alone sufficient."
The revival discourages merchants from concentrating on maximizing profit. It asks them to avoid coming to the bazaar early and leaving it late.
It urges those who earn enough to leave the bazaar early and focus on worship.
The revival also claims that merchants should not participate in maritime trade.
It even cites a fabricated hadith to support this judgment: do not travel in the sea except for pilgrimage or jihad. Although these passages can give an idea about the cultural milieu of Anatolia and possibly other Muslim-populated parts of the Ottoman Empire, one still should not exaggerate their impact on merchants' attitudes.
Unlike Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, Arab Muslim merchants in the Indian Ocean were very successful in seafaring trade until the Portuguese destroyed their ships and occupied their ports.
In sum, Ottoman merchants could not compete with their European counterparts in long-distance maritime trade primarily because the former were marginalized by the Ulamat state alliance at home. Ottoman rulers were not preoccupied with the poor conditions of merchants because their main economic concern was to ensure an uninterrupted flow of the principal foodstuffs for cities, particularly Istanbul. As long as cities did not have a shortage or high prices, Ottoman rulers did not care much whether foreign or local merchants supplied goods. Due to this provisionist policy, the Ottoman state sometimes banned exports to other countries. Moreover, Ottoman sultans willingly signed capitulations and contracts providing privileges to foreign merchants with certain European states. Although capitulations were bilateral agreements based on mutual benefits, they gradually served European merchants' domination of the Ottoman markets. Geopolitical considerations also informed the Sultan's consent to these agreements, which harmed Ottoman merchants' and manufacturers' interests. By consenting to such capitulations, the Sultans hoped to give France, 1569, England, 1580, and the Dutch Republic, the Netherlands, 1612, advantages against the Habsburgs. European governments of the time, by contrast, were largely mercantilist. They supported their own merchants and manufacturers by opening, at times by force, markets for exports while restricting imports. According to Analysic, by the end of the 17th century, the Dutch and English economies threatened Ottoman economic interests thanks to the mass production of crops like cotton and sugar in their colonies and the superior quality of many of their manufactures. Yet in response to these challenges, the Ottomans had no systematic policy to protect and improve native industries. Nor were the Safavids in a better position against these European competitors. The rise of Western Europe. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, Western Europe achieved intellectual, economic, and military advances often referred to collectively as the rise of the West. Many scholars have pointed to the political decentralization in Europe as the cause of these developments and have contrasted them against political centralization in the Muslim world in China. On the one hand, one should not exaggerate the role of political decentralization in the rise of Western Europe. Political decentralization is not always a positive factor. Under certain circumstances, it may imply disorder. After the fall of Rome, Western Europe had centuries of general political decentralization without anything resembling the economic and intellectual progress that it would enjoy in later centuries. The Carolingian Empire's relatively centralized rule in the 9th century is generally regarded as a positive exception. 5 centuries after Rome's fall, around 990, there were hundreds of principalities, bishoprics, city-states, and other authorities in Western Europe, which was still a backward corner of the Old World. On the other hand, the combination of political decentralization with other factors, such as a creative scholarly class and dynamic merchant class, would become a cause of intellectual and economic progress, as seen in some periods of early Islamic history. Chapter 5 explored multiple transformations in Western Europe between the 11th and 14th centuries, including economic growth and institutional diversification. Economic growth led to the emergence of merchants and artisans/craftsmen as challengers to the two dominant classes, the military elite and the clergy.
The main causes of institutional diversification were the opening of universities and the emerging balance of power between the Catholic Church and monarchs. Combined with these transformations, political decentralization turned into a positive factor for the multidimensional rise of Western Europe. Similarly, political centralization is not inherently a regressive factor, as long as it coexists with a certain level of doctrinal and institutional diversity. The main problematic aspect of political centralization in the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires was its maintenance of doctrinal and institutional hegemony, what I call the ulama-state alliance. Some scholars have presented Ming China, 1368 to 1644, as a case where a centralized state established the doctrinal hegemony of Confucianism. Possibly as a reaction to alien rule under the preceding Mongol Yuan dynasty, the Ming promoted cultural conservatism, particularly through its educational system, which required years-long memorization of Confucian texts to succeed in the civil service examinations, thus hindering creativity and innovation. According to Charles Tilly, by around 1200, Western Europe had hundreds of political authorities, particularly in the territories of Holy Roman Empire, which encompassed present-day Germany and northern Italy. In fact, the Italian peninsula alone hosted 200 or 300 distinct city-states. This decentralization led to economic, intellectual, and artistic competition and creativity. Among the Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa led in intercontinental trade, while Florence gained wealth from trade and banking and promoted literature and arts. From the mid-15th to the mid-16th century, Florence was the center of the Italian Renaissance under the leadership of the Medicis, a bourgeois family who patronized artists, including Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo, and scholars, including Galileo. The Medicis represented the political influence of the bourgeoisie, including merchants, bankers, and manufacturers, in European politics. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, the Medicis produced 3 popes and 2 regent queens of France. While Italian cities led Western Europe in an artistic revival, a German city took the lead in printing. In Mainz, Gutenberg, who used private loans, printed the first mass-produced book, the Gutenberg Bible, with metal movable type in 1455. Gutenberg's efforts initiated a printing revolution across Western Europe. By 1480, printing presses were operating in 110 Western European towns, mostly in Italy and Germany. By 1500, Western European presses produced 10,000 to 15,000 different books and an estimated 15 to 20 million copies of books. It was unthinkable in the Ottoman Empire for a private entrepreneur to take such a groundbreaking initiative. As Chapter 7 will explain, about 3 centuries after Gutenberg, an Ottoman state servant established the first Muslim printing press only with the direct support of some high-ranking officials and the permission of the Sultan and Sheikh al-Islam. In The Long Road to the Industrial Revolution, Van Zanden explains that the establishment of printing presses was both an effect of the growing demand for books and a cause of the subsequent flourishing of book publishing. For Van Zanden, the highly tentative estimates of the average literacy rates in Western Europe calculated based on percentages of those signing their names in documents such as marriage contracts showed an increase from 1.3% in the 11th century to 3.4% in the 12th century, 5.7% in the 13th century, 6.8% in the 14th century, and 8.6% in the first half of the 15th century. Estimates of Western European manuscript production also indicate a similar growth, from around 11,000 in the 7th century to 44,000 in the 8th century, 202,000 in the 9th century, 136,000 in the 10th century, 212,000 in the 11th century, 769,000 in the 12th century, 1.7 million in the 13th century, 2.7 million in the 14th century, and about 5 million in the 15th century. The increase in manuscript production from the 12th century on was associated with the rising number of universities. Printing presses sharply reduced the cost of book production. The estimated number of books printed in Europe, including Russia, per century kept increasing, from 12.5 million in the second half of the 15th century to 218 million in the 16th century, 500 million in the 17th century, and nearly 1 billion in the 18th century. In Europe, just in the year 1550, the number of printed books was 3 million, more than the total number of manuscripts produced during the entire 14th century. This increased printing admittedly coincided with substantial population growth in Europe. Nevertheless, the increase in book production was still revolutionary, a 30-fold increase European per capita production from 1450/1500 to 1700/1800. Although China had a larger population and was the origin of printing technology, it fell behind Western Europe. Between 1522 and 1644, the estimated average annual book production in Western Europe was 40 times higher than that in China. Benedict Anderson points to print capitalism, which combined printing technology and capitalist entrepreneurs, as an engine for epochal transformations in Western Europe, particularly the rise of popular nationalism. According to Anderson, print capitalism led to both secularization and vernacularization. Secularization, that is, the declining public importance of religion, included the replacement of a messianic conception of time with a more secular conception. Vernacularization implied the rise of vernacular languages at the expense of Latin. A parallel process was the Protestant Reformation, which challenged the continental hegemony of the Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation received substantial support from printing presses, particularly in German cities. Luther, 1483 to 1546, published his 95 Theses in 1517 and his German translation of the New Testament 5 years later. The role of the Protestant Reformation in the rise of Western Europe has been a controversial topic. It would be reasonable to see the rising bourgeoisie, printing presses, the increasing literacy rate, and the Reformation as interconnected processes. This interconnection was visible in England, which established its Church of England, and the Netherlands, which mostly embraced Calvinism, both of which had influential bourgeois classes shaping parliamentary politics and attained high literacy rates. In England, the estimated literacy rate increased from 15% in 1600 to over 50% in 1800. In the Netherlands, the estimated rates were even more impressive, over 45% in 1600 and 75% in 1800. Two Catholic countries, Spain and Portugal, did not make significant contributions to either the Renaissance or the printing revolution, but both were pioneers in geographical explorations, which owed much to royal funds and efforts. With the support of the Spanish monarchs, Columbus reached the New World in 1492. The Spanish crown sponsored other explorations, including Magellan and Elcano's circumnavigation of the globe in 1519–22. Following these initial ventures, Spain colonized the Americas. Given their technological and military superiority, the Spaniards dominated the natives, who did not have horses, wheels, steel, or gunpowder. Moreover, the Spaniards carried foreign germs and infectious diseases into the Americas, killing much of the indigenous population, which lacked immunity to them. Almost simultaneously, the Portuguese crown organized its own expeditions. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, and Cabral reached what would be called Brazil in 1500. Like the Spaniards in other parts of the Americas, the Portuguese dominated the indigenous people of Brazil and exploited their land and resources. Despite some Indian and Ottoman resistance, the Portuguese also established a maritime trade route between the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, which would later be used by Dutch and English merchants. This new route harmed the commercial interests of not only the Ottoman Empire but also its main partner in the Mediterranean trade, Venice. Moreover, the flow of American silver to Eurasia led to inflation in the Ottoman economy between the late 16th and the early 17th century. In short, around the beginning of the 16th century, Western Europe had experienced multiple processes, including the Renaissance, the printing revolution, the Protestant Reformation, and geographical explorations. At that time, again according to Tilly, there were between 80 and 500 independent political units in Western Europe, based on varying definitions. Charles V, r. 1519–56, a Catholic Habsburg, challenged this decentralization by ruling today Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, half of Italy, and Austria. Nonetheless, even Charles could not dominate Western Europe. If his rule had inaugurated a universal Catholic empire, this could have promoted conservatism in Western Europe as centralized empires did in the Muslim world. In Spain, the exclusionary policies of the Catholic monarchy led to both conservatism and economic failure despite the substantial wealth looted from the Americas. The Spanish monarchy used the American bullion to sustain its unproductive rentier system. The Spanish system was based on the alliance between the Catholic clergy and the aristocracy, in many ways similar to the Ulamat state alliance in Muslim empires. With the support of the crown,
the Catholic clergy used the Spanish Inquisition to eradicate heretics, particularly crypto-Muslims and crypto-Jews, who were forced to convert to Catholicism but were suspected of maintaining their old beliefs and traditions. The Spanish Inquisition began in the late 15th century and continued over 3 centuries. Given this oppression, a significant number of Muslims and Jews left Spain or were expelled, with negative consequences on the Spanish economy. Furthermore, the Spanish monarchy overtaxed its people and often violated their property rights. As a result, Spain faced several economic crises starting in the late 16th century. Spain's intolerant imperial policies also led to the Dutch revolt. During the reign of Philip II, the son of Charles V, the mostly Protestant population of the Netherlands revolted against the Spanish Empire, culminating in the establishment of an independent Dutch Republic in the late 16th century. Unlike in Spain, in the Dutch Republic, merchants were the engine of a trade-based economy, as well as parliamentary politics. Also unlike Spain, the Dutch Republic accommodated a certain level of religious diversity. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic created a virtuous circle of achievements in commerce, philosophy and the natural sciences, the arts, and the military. The Netherlands hosted and produced several pioneering scholars. Although he was a French citizen, Descartes, 1596 to 1650, spent more than 2 decades in the Netherlands. He was an eminent mathematician and has generally been regarded as the founder of rationalism. Another principal philosopher of rationalism, Spinoza, 1632 to 77, who criticized Cartesian mind-body duality, also lived in the Netherlands. A famous Dutch jurist of that period, Grotius, 1583 to 1645, followed the opposite trajectory of Descartes. He fled from the Netherlands to France and lived there for more than a decade. Grotius wrote on natural law and has been regarded as the father of international law. The Dutch people reached the highest estimated literacy rate in the world between 1600, 45%, and 1800, 75%. Book production also reflected the high literacy rate. In the first half of the 18th century, while its population was only 2 million, the Netherlands produced about 52 million books. Dutch schooling rates were very high too. In the 17th century, it reached around 10%. In the same period, the Netherlands had a comparatively high university enrollment rate as well. This human capital development became the basis of the Netherlands' economic growth and military power, which was disproportionate to its small population and territory. The Dutch East India Company was founded in the early 17th century and became the first corporation to issue shares to the public. The company acted as the Dutch agent in colonizing Muslim lands in the Indonesian archipelago. Similar to its Portuguese predecessor, the Dutch colonization was very violent. In the 16th and 17th centuries, England was another military and commercial rival of the Spanish Empire. Like their Dutch counterparts, the English bourgeoisie enjoyed increasing political influence. This influence was visible in the strengthening protection of property rights, including patents, in the English legal system. The East India Company was founded almost simultaneously to its Dutch counterpart and played an important role in the expansion of English maritime trade. England also achieved educational, philosophical, and scientific progress. Cambridge and Oxford emerged as leading European universities. Bacon, 1561 to 1626, an English champion of modern science and philosopher, became one of the founders of empiricism. Later, Locke, 1632 to 1704, wrote the foundational text of empiricism, an essay concerning human understanding, where he refutes Descartes' notion of innate ideas. Instead, Locke argues that the source of knowledge is human experience through sensation and/or reflection. English scholars also excelled in the natural sciences. Harvey, 1578 to 1657, became the first physician to discern by experimentation the full blood circulation through the human body. England also produced Newton, 1643 to 1727, who arguably culminated the scientific revolution begun by Copernicus. In sum, the rise of Western Europe resulted from the overlapping processes of the Renaissance, the printing revolution, the Protestant Reformation, geographical discoveries, and the scientific revolution. During this period, the Muslim world neither produced comparable developments nor learned from European experiences.
Western Europe had clearly surpassed the Muslim world in the natural sciences and philosophy by the early 17th century. In terms of economic growth, European and Muslim countries had substantial internal variation, which makes it difficult to evaluate them as two groups until the early 19th century. According to Kavanch Karaman and Pamuk, by the second half of the 18th century, GDP per capita in England and the Dutch Republic, the two economically most successful European cases, was approximately double that of the Ottoman Empire. However, GDP per capita in several other Western European countries was slightly more than that of the Ottoman Empire until the early 19th century. Two social classes played leading roles in developments in Western Europe. One was the bourgeoisie, as seen in the relations between the Medicis and the Renaissance, the German and Italian bourgeoisie and print capitalism, and the Dutch and English bourgeoisie and the multidimensional rise of the Netherlands and England. The other was the intellectual class, which included university professors, independent scholars, and dissenting theologians. Together, these thinkers weakened the ideational dominance of the Catholic Church. Moreover, leading European scholars revolutionized the natural sciences by refuting Ptolemaic astronomy and Galenic anatomy/physiology. They also promoted rationalism and empiricism, which challenged Aristotelian epistemology. Thus, the intellectual class became the engine of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. In sum, the combined efforts of the bourgeoisie and the intellectuals enabled the rise of Western Europe. The ruling elite and the Catholic clergy also made some contributions to Western European progress. Spanish rulers, for example, patronized geographical explorations. Spain, however, also shows that centralized state authority, which in that case pursued rentier policies and persecuted religious minorities, could be a reactionary force. Similarly, some members of the Catholic clergy, especially Aquinas of the 13th century, had been pivotal in advancing philosophical studies in Western Europe. Yet overall, the Catholic clergy played a reactionary role as seen in the case of the Inquisition. Therefore, the bourgeoisie and intellectuals generally had to confront the rulers and clergy while pursuing their progressive agendas in Western Europe. Alternative explanations of the rise of Western Europe. My explanations of both the rise of Western Europe and the decline of the Muslim world are similarly based on class relations. The influence of the bourgeoisie and the intellectuals were the main pillars of economic and intellectual progress in Western Europe, whereas the undermining of these two classes by the Ulamat-state alliance led to economic and intellectual stagnation in Muslim societies. Several scholars have already stressed the importance of the bourgeoisie in Western developments. My argument adds the role of the intellectuals to this approach. In the massive literature on the rise of Western Europe, two alternative explanations have been particularly influential. The first one can be defined as the anti-colonial approach. It is a broad research project featuring contributions from many scholars. According to this explanatory narrative, around 1500, Western Europe was economically marginalized given its geographical location. Necessity, therefore, led Europeans to search for a sea route to India. They accidentally discovered the Americas. Following this fortunate coincidence, Europeans colonized the New World and exploited its resources, as well as those of several Asian and African countries. Nonetheless, until around 1800, there was no divergence yet between economically advanced parts of Western Europe and those of Asia. Around that time, England combined the advantages of its colonies and accessible coal reserves, initiated the Industrial Revolution, and became a model for other Western European countries. This is by and large how Western Europe eventually surpassed Asia in wealth. Although I share some of anti-colonial scholars' criticisms of culturally or geographically deterministic explanations of the rise of the West, I still have 9 main disagreements with these scholars' broad narrative. First, immediately before the overseas explorations around 1500, Western Europe was no longer a minor actor in the world economy. Second, it was mostly Spain and Portugal, not all of Western Europe, which was marginalized in existing commercial routes. Venice, by contrast, was effectively using them and, despite certain problems, collaborated with the Ottomans in intercontinental trade. Third, necessity does not always lead to innovations or discoveries. At least from the 19th century to the present, many Asian and African countries have had major crises and necessities without major innovations or discoveries. Fourth, even if Columbus had not unintentionally reached the Americas, another Iberian explorer would have reached it anyway, given that many Iberians before and after him frequently explored oceans and even circumnavigated the Earth. Fifth, in general, world historical developments do not follow accidental trajectories. Major transformations are results of long-term, complex processes. Sixth, although the exploitation of American resources enriched the countries of Western Europe, their economic growth began earlier than this exploitation. Furthermore, the expropriation of American bullion did not sustain long-term economic development for that resource's main exploiter, Spain. Similarly, European colonization of Africa and Asia also contributed to European economic growth through slavery and other means of exploitation, but the rise of Western Europe was too multifaceted and complex to be explained with reference to colonialism alone. Moreover, one should ask what made Western Europeans so powerful vis-a-vis others, particularly former powers like the Muslim and Chinese empires. I will elaborate the issue of colonialism in Chapter 7. Seventh, several scholars have noted that the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England was a gradual result of earlier economic, intellectual, and political developments, rather than an abrupt change. Eighth, one should not exaggerate the role of English coal reserves in industrialization. Muslim countries had 60% of the world's oil reserves, but this wealth of natural resources did not lead to an economic or technological breakthrough. Finally, this explanatory narrative is too materialistic. It focuses on colonial exploitation and industrialization, as if the intellectual development was irrelevant to the rise of Western Europe. In reality, European educational, philosophical, and scientific achievements supported economic growth by promoting human capital and facilitating conditions for innovation. The second alternative explanation for the rise of Western Europe has been provided by scholars of the New Institutionalist School. In The Rise of the Western World, Douglas North and Robert Thomas point to the protection of property rights as a crucial factor that would create an incentive to channel individual economic effort. Without such protection, few would risk private resources for social gains. North and Thomas explain not only the rise of Western Europe but also the divergence between various Western European countries stemming from differing regimes of property right protection in the 16th and particularly 17th centuries. The Spanish state deprived minorities, Jews and Muslims, of their property beginning around 1492. This policy was symptomatic of the insecurity of all property rights in Spain. The more the Spanish crown faced financial difficulties, the more it confiscated private properties. Consequently, people were driven out of productive pursuits. As no property right was secure, economic retardation was the inevitable consequence. North and Thomas contrast Spain with the opposite cases of the Netherlands and England, where the protection of property rights led to economic growth. Later, North and Barry Weingast singled out the Glorious Revolution, 1688, which consolidated parliamentary limits on monarchical authority, as a landmark event in the institutionalization of the protection of property rights in England. In the subsequent decade, institutional reforms helped not only private entrepreneurs but also the government, which gained access to an unprecedented level of funds from lenders who perceived that the government would honor its agreements. The path-dependent impact of the Glorious Revolution enabled subsequent British economic achievement. Elsewhere, North drew even broader conclusions. The security of property rights and the development of the public and private capital market were instrumental factors not only in England's subsequent rapid economic development, but in its political hegemony and ultimate dominance of the world. Menker-Olson developed a similar argument. Individual rights to property and contract enforcement were probably more secure in Britain after 1689 than anywhere else, and it was in Britain, not very long after the Glorious Revolution, that the Industrial Revolution began. This new institutionalist argument is largely complementary with my argument. Nonetheless, the two differ on an important point. The new institutionalists overemphasize institutions, such as laws protecting property rights, at the expense of human agency. By contrast, I stress the roles of human agents in the making of institutions. In the British and Dutch cases, the bourgeoisie and intellectuals played important roles in the formation of institutions. The bourgeoisie were powerful and shaped parliamentary politics, while the intellectuals provided ideological legitimacy for the protection of property and other liberal institutions. Laws and legal texts do not matter unless there are influential groups of individuals who enforce them by political power and legitimize them by ideologies.
From the 19th century to the present, many Asian and African countries have followed the British model and passed laws to ensure property rights.
Yet due to the absence of influential bourgeois and intellectual classes to support them, these laws have by and large remained ineffective.
These are my criticisms about the two alternative explanations of the anti-colonial approach and the new institutionalism of the rise of Western Europe. I use the same argument, which emphasizes the class relations, for the decline of the Muslim world.
The next section critically evaluates alternative explanations of this issue. Alternative explanations of the decline of the Muslim world.
I will examine three significant examples of works on the decline of the Muslim world in order to elaborate the ways in which they differ from my analysis. The first one is Lisa Blades and Eric Cheney's article, The Feudal Revolution and Europe's Rise, Political Divergence of the Christian West and the Muslim World Before 1500 CE, 2013. Blades and Cheney assess political divergence based on different levels of political stability. While measuring political stability, the authors provide comparative data about the durations of monarchs' rules. They argue that from 1100 to 1500, Western European monarchs remained in power, on average, longer than their Muslim counterparts. The shorter average tenure of Muslim monarchs suggests that Muslims had less stable polities than Europeans. For the authors, the average duration of a monarch's rule was tied to the presence or absence of slave soldiers. Slave soldiers shortened reigns, destabilized politics, and weakened civil society in the Muslim world, whereas the absence of slave soldiers ultimately enabled the rise of Western Europe.
I have four main reservations about this well-researched article.
First, Blades and Cheney's focus on political stability explains very little about how Western Europe rose and surpassed the Muslim world. Both of these interrelated developments entailed complex processes, which included intellectual and socio-economic dimensions. Political stability per se was not so crucial. The Ottoman Empire was politically stable. It was ruled by a single family for 6 centuries. Thus, political stability cannot explain the eventual divergence between the Ottomans and Western Europeans.
Second, Blades and Cheney's data show that the average duration of monarchs' rules was shorter in the Muslim world than in Western Europe. However, this finding does not necessarily indicate more political stability in the latter.
In fact, most countries in the contemporary Middle East have experienced a dictator staying in power for decades. No one, however, would define the Middle East as politically more stable than Europe.
Third, the duration of a monarch's rule may be affected by various factors besides the presence or absence of slave soldiers.
These factors include elite competition, economic conditions, and the perception of monarchs as sacred. Bloch explains that very few Western European monarchs, especially English and French kings, were murdered roughly between 1000 and 1300 as a result of their sacred status. He writes, the kings of France, certainly from Philip I and probably from Robert the Pious, and the kings of England, from Henry I, were believed to possess the power to cure certain sickness by the touch of their hands. A smaller number of English and French kings therefore died a violent death at the hand of their subjects, in contrast to larger numbers of Muslim monarchs and European vassals killed, by comparison with the hecatombs of Islamic history, or with what the West itself could show in the number of great vassals murdered, and considering the general moral outlook of this age of violence, this number seems small indeed. Finally, Blades and Cheney argue that the presence of slave soldiers made Muslim monarchs absolute authorities, unlike European monarchs, who needed to negotiate with local notables. According to the authors, Muslim monarchs had shorter reigns despite being absolutist rulers because slave soldiers deposed them in several cases. If this explanation is true, then why did Muslim monarchs prefer to have slave soldiers for centuries? Moreover, the author's depiction of slave soldiers as inherently detached from society is questionable. In the Ottoman case, the Janissary revolts incorporated members of the ulama and the people of Istanbul. In the words of Serif Mardin, the Janissaries were not confined to their barracks, but mingled with the bazaar population. Thus, their revolts often had two dimensions, one military and the other civilian, and the two were supposed to work in tandem. Timur Quran's The Long Divergence offers a much more complex account of the divergence. In comparison to Blades and Cheney's focus on political stability and slave soldiers, Quran analyzes long-term economic development and its institutional causes. Quran argues that Islamic law, particularly regarding inheritance, partnership, and wax, inhibited economic development and led to the weakness of civil society in the Muslim world between the 11th and 18th centuries. For him, Islamic law distributed inheritance among too many persons, which dissolved partnerships and hindered capital accumulation. Islamic law on partnership did not recognize impersonal entities, hence, it prevented the establishment of large corporations. Islamic waqfs were unable to adapt to changing socio-economic conditions due to their inflexible rules, thus, the endowed properties were used in economically inefficient ways. According to Quran, Muslim societies were stuck with these problematic laws, which had worked relatively well in the early Middle Ages but later hindered Muslim economic development for about a millennium. In the 19th century, Muslim countries began reforming these laws based on Western models, but it was too late to catch up with Western competitors in the international economic system. I agree with Quran that institutional dynamism and efficiency helped Western actors surpass their Muslim competitors. Quran's explanation of the ways in which Islamic law restricted the formation of big corporations is convincing. As a related issue, some other scholars have stressed how credit and banking institutions emerged earlier in Muslim lands than they did in Western Europe. Later, however, Muslim financial institutions stagnated. Quran's emphasis on the economic inefficiencies of Islamic waqfs is persuasive too. Other scholars have also noted that Muslim waqfs were less flexible and effective than Western alternatives. Nevertheless, Quran's comparison of Islamic and Western laws of inheritance leaves many questions unanswered. He seems to be criticizing Islamic law for distributing assets to too many inheritors, sons and daughters, father and mother, and even some other male and female relatives in comparison to primogeniture in many European countries, which strongly favored the firstborn son in inheritance and facilitated capital accumulation. Empirically, Quran does not sufficiently document such a causal relationship between Islamic inheritance law and the lack of private wealth accumulation. My main disagreement with Quran pertains to his overemphasis on law at the expense of the ulama and the state. Quran's central argument, articulated in his book's subtitle, How Islamic Law Held Back the Middle East, points to Islamic law as if it single-handedly shaped Muslim institutions for centuries. Yet Quran's book in fact contains a complex analysis that provides readers with data about the significance of the ulama and the state as well. In other words, his analysis includes many insights and data that are complementary to, or at least compatible with, my argument emphasizing the roles of the ulama and the state. I will clarify this issue with reference to 5 examples. First, Quran acknowledges that the ulama constructed Islamic law even by drawing from pre-Islamic traditions. Muslim jurists who developed an Islamic law of partnership did not start from scratch. They built on established customs of Arabia, Mesopotamia, Persia, and Greece, and also Jewish and Christian traditions. Second, Quran recognizes the role of rulers in Muslim countries' legal systems. He writes that, from an early period onward the military was reorganized, sundry fines and tolls were imposed, the tax system was altered, and rules governing the inheritance of land were revised, all by decree and with only the flimsiest basis in Islamic law. Third, Quran notes how the absence of a strong merchant class was an important factor for the persistence of problematic aspects of Islamic partnership law. If some major constituency had pressured the Islamic court system to grant legal personhood to commercial organizations, religious obstacles could have been overcome. These 3 examples stress the impact of class relations, strong ulama and rulers vis-a-vis weak merchants, on legal issues. Even Islamic law itself appears to be largely an effect of class relations, rather than being the independent cause of Muslims' economic conditions. Fourth, in the case of the Ottomans, Quran emphasizes the centralized state authority, rather than certain characteristics of Islamic law, when explaining the lack of autonomous guilds. Until the mid-15th century, guilds gained autonomy, because Anatolia was in turmoil, with weak statelets vying for authority in the face of frequently shifting boundaries, much as in Western Europe during the half-millennium that saw the proliferation of the earliest religious and urban corporations. If the political turmoil had continued, the guilds might have developed corporate features. Yet the Ottomans managed to unite Anatolia, opted to make guilds to serve state goals, and saw no reason to grant them legal personhood. Quran also highlights the centralized state while explaining Ottoman waqfs. Many officials and merchants sheltered wealth within waqfs, because property rights were not protected against state seizure. In short, Quran's explanations of both the absence of autonomous guilds and the mushrooming of waqfs in the Ottoman Empire are, at least partially, based on the negative policies of the centralized state, rather than merely the nature of Islamic law. Finally, Quran examines the difference between a Quranic principle and the Muslim practice regarding contracts. A Quranic verse, 2:282, orders, believers, when you contract a debt for a fixed period, put it in writing. Do not fail to put your debts in writing, be they small or big, together with the day of payment. Nonetheless, Quran notices that a large majority of litigants who faced off in 17th century Istanbul courts were doing business in violation of this rule. Even debt contracts, explicitly required to be documented, were left undocumented. He explains this attitude as primarily a result of the fact that documentation carried the risk of transmitting information to officials prepared to grab resources wherever possible. The oral legal culture of Ottoman society, Quran concludes, was grounded, then, in the prevailing political and economic conditions. It did not stem from some essential element of Islamic doctrine. In sum, despite its subtitle and central argument emphasizing Islamic law per se, Quran's book includes significant data and convincing analyses about the roles of particular class relations in state policies in the economic underdevelopment of the Muslim world. Thus, certain parts of Quran's book agree with my argument that the ulama and the state were the principal factors that both made Islamic law ineffective and held back the Muslim world. The third and last work I will discuss is Jared Rubin's Rulers, Religion, and Riches, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East Did Not. There are many similarities between Rubin's central argument and mine. For Rubin, the Netherlands and England achieved economic progress because the economic elite became effective in their policy-making processes following the printing revolution and the Protestant Reformation. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, remained economically stagnant because religious authorities rather than an economic elite provided legitimacy to the rulers and held an important seat in the political bargaining table. Ottoman religious authorities blocked progressive efforts, such as the establishment of printing presses. Spain was similar to the Ottoman Empire in terms of religious actors' political efficacy and the resulting economic stagnation. Nonetheless, Rubin's analysis differs from my own in two important respects. First, according to Rubin, Islam has always provided a unifying ideology to religious and state actors, and thus the Ottoman pattern of class relations, politically favoring the ulama and undermining the merchants, was just a continuation of this robust ideology. Rubin argues that the economic elite never had a place at the bargaining table because Middle Eastern rulers were strong enough, due to the legitimizing capacity of Islam, to exclude them. Thus for Rubin, before the year 1002, religious rather than commercial actors shaped policy in Muslim states, but for some reason under early medieval conditions this arrangement did not hinder economic progress. I argue the opposite. In early Islamic history, merchants were an influential class, and that status was one of the reasons for Muslims' economic progress. Later, I stress, the marginalization of merchants harmed Muslim economies. Second, although Rubin repeatedly insists that his argument does not essentialize Islam, in reality it does just that. Rubin asserts that Christian doctrine was essentially different and was not as conducive to legitimizing political authority as Islamic doctrine was. He also writes, these doctrinal differences are clear in the Bible and the Quran. For him, the capacity of the religious elite to legitimize political rule, which impeded economic development, was stronger in Islam than in Catholicism, and minimal in Protestantism. To support this claim, Rubin even quotes the fabricated hadith. Muhammad himself claimed that Islam and government are twin brothers. One cannot thrive without the other. Islam is the foundation, and government the guardian. What has no foundation collapses, what has no guarding, perishes. I have explained that this statement is a Sasanian maxim, not a hadith, and that it reflects the post-11th century mentality of the ulama. Chapter 4 also documented that many leading Islamic scholars refused to be state servants until the 11th century. The Ottoman model of the Ulamat-state alliance, therefore, represents neither a textual essence of Islam nor the entire Islamic history. Instead, it is a phenomenon constructed during a particular period of Islamic history. Rubin's portrayal of Christianity is problematic too. The Eastern Orthodox Church, for example, strongly legitimized and even accepted the superiority of political rulers in the Byzantine Empire, under so-called Caesaropapism. This point contradicts Rubin's argument that Christianity's historical origin rendered it less capable of legitimizing political rule compared with Islam. I am not opposed to Rubin's usage of religious ideas as an explanatory variable. On the contrary, my criticism is that he does not examine such ideas in a sufficiently extensive and deep manner. Simply claiming an Islamic ideology of religion-state unity is insufficient. For this reason, I have explored changing Muslim ideas on religion-state relations from early Islamic history to the present. These ideas are not simply written in religious texts but are interpreted and articulated by scholars. In early Islamic history, an intellectual class including philosophers, dissenting theologians, and Islamic scholars who refused to serve the state played a crucial role in Muslims' intellectual achievement. Later, however, the ulama-state alliance undermined both intellectuals and merchants. This undermining came with a doctrinal transformation on many issues, including Islam's relations with the state. Regarding these issues, my analysis differs substantially from that of Rubin. Conclusion. In the early 16th century, three powerful Muslim empires of the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal ruled large territories. 2 centuries later, Muslim empires had lost their military dominance and faced complex political and socio-economic crises. This chapter has argued that even during the period of military power, these empires had substantial intellectual and economic handicaps, which led to their eventual decline. Their common problem had to do with class relations. The ulama-state alliance prevented the emergence of independent scholars and marginalized the merchants. Intellectually and economically, Muslims lacked creativity and remained indifferent to European advancements, including the printing revolution and the scientific revolution. In the Ottoman Empire, the ulama-state alliance was very elitist. The ulama and officials defined the rest of society as raya, which can be translated as the subjects or the flock. The emergence of civil society independent of the state was not possible in such a system. Moreover, the hierarchical nature of Ottoman socio-economic structure hindered individual innovation. Unlike the Dutch and English states, the Ottoman state did not effectively protect property rights, another major disincentive for individual entrepreneurship and creativity. As a result, very few innovators, discoverers, or entrepreneurs emerged in the Ottoman Empire, as was the case in the Safavid and Mughal empires and in contrast to much of Western Europe. Western Europe underwent multiple processes of development between the 15th and 17th centuries. The intellectuals and the bourgeoisie played major roles in these interdependent developments. The Renaissance promoted interests in not only the human body and nature but also arts and philosophy. The printing revolution led to unprecedented increases in book production and literacy. Geographical discoveries expanded Europe's commercial capacity. Printing presses also contributed to the Protestant Reformation by disseminating texts criticizing the Catholic Church. The scientific revolution produced new knowledge and perspectives on human body and nature, and challenged established Aristotelian and Catholic notions. In the 17th century, the Netherlands and England exemplified the artistic, philosophical, commercial, scientific, and political aspects of the rise of Western Europe. European economic growth was certainly linked to the exploitation of American, African, and Asian resources and people. Nonetheless, focusing only on colonial exploitation and disregarding intellectual and institutional developments misses important aspects of the rise of Western Europe. Chapter 7 will focus on the 18th and 19th centuries. It analyzes how European powers established either direct or indirect colonial rule across the Muslim world. The chapter will also examine how Muslim officials and intellectuals tried to respond to European challenges with institutional and intellectual reforms.